You're listening to the Warriors of Dystonia podcast, a podcast sharing the stories and journeys of people whose lives are affected by dystonia. My name is Carl, and I've had cervical dystonia since 2007. I started this project to spread awareness of the condition, as well as reminding those in the dystonia community that they are not alone. In 2021, I released a book called Warriors of Dystonia that collects first-hand experiences of people all over the world who have been affected by dystonia. You can find the book on lulu.com, that's LULU.com, as well as Amazon. All profits from sales go to dystonia charity and research. Now, onto the podcast. In this episode of the Warriors of Dystonia podcast, I talk with Shelby, who kindly chatted to me about her experience of living with dopamine responsive dystonia, which she was diagnosed with at the age of 7. First of all, welcome and thank you so much for being on the podcast, Shelby.
Yeah, thank you for letting me reach out to you and push myself in here. I'm excited to talk about it.
You're very welcome. So to start off with, could you introduce yourself and tell us about you?
My name is Shelby, and I am from the U.S., originally from Indiana, just north of Indianapolis. And I currently reside in West Virginia as of the last 4 days. So, but I have been diagnosed with dopamine responsive dystonia since I was 7. So as a child, there were no symptoms prior to toddling around, and I did begin to toddle as a child, but very quickly my feet started to turn in perpendicular to my body. And I started to have to walk on the outsides of my feet. I was losing motor control from the toes up towards the rest of my body, starting in toddlerhood. So I was never able to properly walk. I was able to pick up my legs with my hips and make that kind of motion. I was able to crawl around quite easily, but I was never able to walk. And so when I was about 3 or 4, my parents started, taking me to doctors and trying to figure out, what is this? And at first it was, she's just pigeon-toed, she'll grow out of it. But the doctors didn't quite understand that it wasn't just my feet turning in and staying relatively relaxed in that position. It was muscle spasms, pretty constant muscle spasms. It wasn't just, this is the angle of her bones. It wasn't that. And so I spent most of my childhood between the ages of 3 and 7 going to a myriad of hospitals trying to figure out exactly what this was. And of course, just like most people with any form of dystonia, you work your way through the laundry list of misdiagnoses to get to, hopefully, eventually, to getting the correct diagnosis. We went through lots and lots of doctors, lots of MRIs, lots of testing. I remember particularly the MRIs for a child were pretty traumatic, being so loud and trapped in a place and that kind of stuff. And it happened often. Dystonia is not like other things where like the symptoms are pretty easily understood. It seems to people like it just evades them. Like it's harder to understand. Yeah, no, I'm not pulling my foot in. I'm not thinking this thought. My body is doing this for me. And it's a difficult diagnosis because of that, especially in children. So we went to the Shriners Hospital in Kentucky, and I was placed on a regimen of muscle relaxers and leg braces to pull my feet back out to be straight. And I went from a walker at 4 to a wheelchair at 5. The spasms were getting worse. So I didn't have even the ability to stand for long periods of time because I couldn't keep my balance, because I couldn't control my legs. And about that time too, the hand tremors started, the Parkinsonian's tremor in your hands. And it was difficult for me to start writing in school. I learned very early to type and to write in cursive, because cursive, it was at least one long stream. I didn't have to pick up my hand and start over. And so all of that through kindergarten and first grade was the accommodations, the wheelchair, the typing classes, the cursive lessons, to try to make sure that I was able to participate in the education system. On top of that, too, I mean, I've always been a very intellectual child. I was a reader very early, and a lot of that I think has to do with the fact that I couldn't get up and run and go play with my cousins and my sisters. I spent a lot of time reading. But one thing that I found often, especially being in public in a wheelchair as a child, is that most folks did assume intellectual disability along with physical. It was an uphill battle with the school system to be like, no, she doesn't belong in a special education classroom. She belongs in a regular classroom with physical accommodations. It's different. I mean, like, I was reading very, very high level for what I was at. And so my mother and father did a wonderful job of advocating for me in that way, because there wasn't any sort of intellectual delay. It was purely physical. Even being out in public as a child, I remember people stopping and speaking to me like I was a baby, because they couldn't comprehend why somebody would be in a wheelchair but otherwise be like developmentally normal. So when I was in first grade, we went to University of Kentucky to get another opinion from another neurologist. I've met so many neurologists in my day. I was 7 at this time, and the doctors basically said it's probably CP, cerebral palsy, which is a very common misdiagnosis for this kind of thing. But my mother was like, that doesn't make sense. Like, there was no birth trauma. There was nothing that would indicate. There's no cognitive delays. There's nothing that would indicate CP. Like, it was just another stab in the dark. And what they wanted to do was surgically clip both of my Achilles tendons to release the pressure, and also insert a medication pump into my spine that would have to be surgically refilled every 6 weeks. And I was 7. My mother said, hell no. Like, she just knew that wasn't the answer. Something in her told her that's not what we're going to do. It seemed to be too permanent a step to take on a hope of a diagnosis, we hope this is what it is, so we're going to permanently change your child's physiology to try and do it. And she said no, and my dad said no. And so what we did is we went back to our hometown of Anderson, Indiana, which is not a big town, 70,000 people-ish. It's a suburb of a farther northern suburb of the capital of Indiana. And so we went back to a neurologist that had done one of the electrical nerve testing where they stick electrified needles in your feet. That one was not fun as a child. Not a good one. Don't suggest those.
No, that doesn't sound nice.
No, it's not very fun. They do give you a teddy bear afterwards if you're young enough. So
nice.
I for that. I did get a lot of hospital teddy bears that were sewn by the grannies. But we went back to him, and he at that time was not treating children. He only primarily handled Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and geriatric neurology mostly. We called and asked if he would give us a second opinion, because he had treated me a couple of times for testing and things like that. And we went in, and this was in the spring, and I was 7 years old, and he asked me to walk down the hallway. And so I did. I mean, I walked, but like, that was the picking the hips up and stumbling, and my feet on the outsides of my feet and all of that. When I turned around, he was crying. He sat with our family and just cried with us about it. He is a man of faith, and I was raised in the church, and he prayed with us. Just said, help me find an answer for this family. And within a couple of weeks, we got a call from him. My mother got a voicemail, and he said that he had while researching for another patient, he had stumbled across a magazine article in a medical magazine about a young man about my age in Japan with the same exact symptoms. And they had given him Cinemet, carbidopa, levodopa, and it seemed to help. And he said, I know you're going to be going on a trip very soon, but before you do, come in, get the prescription. The worst it's going to do is make her sick, like sick to her stomach. It's going to upset her stomach. The worst that's going to do. The best it's going to do, we don't know. But we want to give it a shot. So I was actually on our way to West Virginia for our family reunion, which happens Memorial Day weekend every year. That happened just a couple days ago. And we always go to a bluegrass festival. It's on the Capitol Square in Charleston, West Virginia. And we were going there, and I remember we stopped and had McDonald's hotcakes. I remember that detail. And I took half a pill. And it was unpleasant because, like, 7-year-olds don't know how to take pills. And Cinemet, the carbidopa, levodopa, especially the fast acting, it dissolves so quickly in your mouth that, like, I remember, like, that terrible medicinal, like, awful, like, I remember that very, very distinctly. This is all the first time I've been, having to take that kind of a pill. So they strapped me in my wheelchair. We went on our way, and we were down in the State Capitol Museum. And I have a sister who's 10 months younger than me, and she always liked to run off and get herself into trouble, and I'm very much the mother hen type. I always wanted to make sure she was fine. And my parents were over to the left of me. They were reading one of the exhibits, and my sister trotted off, and I unbuckled my seatbelt, and I just heel-toed into the other room. And my parents turned around, and they thought I got kidnapped. Because, like, you don't often see your wheelchair kid getting out of, like, just disappearing. So I gave my parents a bit of a fright. I walked in there just to make sure she was okay, and then my parents saw me standing there, and I was fine. And it was half a dose is what I took. And of course, like, tears, and I just felt normal. I mean, I was a 7-year-old kid. I was like, I don't know, seems kind of cool. Like, but of course, for our family reunion, we were here in West Virginia, and everybody all the way up into my great grandparents' generation was here. And so we went back to my great grandfather's house, and I got out of the car, and I walked up those steps unassisted. And everybody's crying and hugging and and all of it, and of course my great grandmother, she's like, you better be careful, like, and of course, as a kid who's never experienced free movement, I was like, well, no thanks. Like, I was just running everywhere. I took another dose, and I was able to, the next day here at the family farm, I was able to run up and down the hills with all of my cousins for the first time and be a kid. And so for the next 4 years of my life, the synthetic dopamine handled all of my symptoms, and I was able to walk and run and play sports and do all of the things that I had never been able to do before. And then puberty happened. And the way the body doesn't particularly like to metabolize Cinemet, carbidopa, levodopa in any kind of way. It likes to ignore that it's there if it can. And so between the metabolism changing of an 11-year-old girl, and between hormones shifting and all that kind of stuff, I was back in a wheelchair for 3 years. The first time around, I never felt particularly different because it was all that I knew. But when I was 11 and I had tasted the freedom of unencumbered movement, and I was back in a wheelchair again, and of course, right before you're going into middle school, which was a hellscape of its own, right?
Absolutely, God.
Yeah. it was emotionally just an entirely different ballgame. And it was really difficult. It took 3 years to get it all kind of figured out. We went to the Mayo Clinic to kind of understand more about it. We had genetic testing done that showed the GCH1 mutation on the gene. And then they told me that taking my medication after I eat would never work for me because synthetic dopamine in your blood system has such a short half-life that by the time your body has metabolized all your food, it gets to the end of the train where your meds are, and it's not going to be as potent. So we had to change to dosing half an hour before eating. That helped. And by the time I was in high school, I was walking again, and I was in marching band, and I was not particularly sports inclined otherwise. Marching band was my sport. I did marching band and then show choir, which is where I started dancing. And then when I went to college, I found swing dancing. After my first swing dance club meeting in college, which was like the first week of college, something just clicked. I had never felt more myself than when I was able to use my body in the way that I wanted and to use it to creatively express and to just connect with other people. Dancing really changed my life because up until then, I didn't think very, very hard about what my condition had done to me mentally. And it was always just a part of my life. It was always just, that's what happens. And then I started dancing, and I realized just how lucky I was to be able to go through life every day and be given the gift of free movement, because I wasn't given that at birth. So dancing really took over my life, and for good reason. So I started learning to swing dance and to blues dance, and within a year, I started teaching those two things. I traveled all over the country teaching dance and DJing, and I specialize in collecting lesser-known women blues artists to share with dancers everywhere, but also having the insight of being so damn bodily aware. It really helps when teaching, especially beginners, because I can tell them, like, I know that you don't ever think about how your legs move, but like that's going to help you. Like if you can like just really just go into your body and like exist in your body and then find your connection to the rest of you, it's going to help you so much. Teaching beginners and helping other people fall in love with movement has been life-changing, and it's one of my favorite things that I've ever done in my life. And so nowadays, my symptoms, if I don't dose daily, they come back, right? But otherwise, I lead from the outside a completely, I hate the word normal, but a completely asymptomatic life. Nobody ever knows for me unless I tell them. And I do often tell people. I mean, it's something that I've never particularly been ashamed of. Like it's such a huge part of who I am. I find solace in humor. So I make a lot of jokes, and my family does too, about like for instance, my nephew is 1 year old and he just started walking. And when my sister told me about it, I was like, wow, he's really ahead of the game. just I find ways to cope through the humor, and that's like one of the like metrics that I have for friends or who I'm dating or whatever, is I know that they finally feel comfortable enough with me to make their first cripple joke.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because I'm not offended by them. I just like it's the reality of my life. And so when they're finally comfortable enough to be like, well, you know, Shelby doesn't walk too good, like it's a moment of like, oh, we've arrived, we've gotten here now.
Yeah.
but now I'm expecting my first baby in September. It's been an interesting adventure trying to talk to doctors about what that means um, with the dystonia stuff. And we went through another round of genetic testing for just confirmation of the GCH1 gene. Upon birth, we can have my daughter tested if we want to. And my family can also go and get tested for the gene mutation. But what interesting thing that we found out through this process is the genetic links that are drawn with other dopamine deficiency disorder movements. My maternal grandfather had struggled with restless leg most of his life and then developed Parkinson's. And his mother had Parkinson's as well. And so when I was speaking with the genetic counselor about my baby and all that kind of stuff, she was like, yeah, it sounds to me like pretty much a lightning rod of genetics right down to you. And so they're genetically related. And basically what that means is that any person who is positive for the mutation on the GCH1 gene has a 50% chance of passing that same gene mutation on to their children. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be symptomatic in any way in any of those 3 or other disorders. It just means that they have the possibility to have some sort of dopamine related issues. So I will have my daughter tested for the gene mutation at birth, and then if it's positive, just keep an eye out for delayed motor skill movement, things like that. But my husband and I made the difficult decision to have a baby. Motherhood is something that I've always wanted, but for a long time I really struggled with the ethics of bringing a child into the world, knowing that I am so genetically different. But I often just came to the conclusion that my childhood was particularly traumatic because we didn't know what it was. That particular hell, I know that all people that struggle with dystonia know that particular hell of what the fuck is happening to me? Like, what it is so terrifying, and it's so isolating to be in that place where nobody will hear you. I know that my daughter won't have to do that. And so for me, it made that decision easier. Regardless of if she has any sort of neurological rarities or not, she will always have an advocate in me. If she does happen to have what I have, we at least have a starting point that's miles and miles ahead of it ever it was for me.
Going back to dystonia awareness, why do you think that even today so few people have actually heard of dystonia?
Well, I think firstly, it's such a hard thing to comprehend even for doctors. I didn't even get a proper diagnosis until we diagnosed through medicating, which is kind of backwards. And it's so hard to pin down, especially because dystonia can be 1,500 different things especially without doctors comprehending what even it is. Like, if the doctors who are supposed to know more than we do don't have any way of comprehending what's happening to our bodies, and we as a community are presenting in myriad different ways anyway, I mean, it's not ever the same. Even within the same kinds of dystonia, like there's just such difference between symptoms. It's also, I think, that the doctors don't particularly understand that you're not faking it. Like, it's not put on. I worried about that a lot as a child, that, like, especially my peers, because I would sometimes be fine and sometimes be not. And especially because it happens all internally, like it's hard for people to wrap their heads around, like, no, this is real. and these people's lived experience is real. And just because you have no possible way of understanding that doesn't mean that it's not real. I think that most people don't have a way of comprehending what it is to be trapped inside a very painful cage. Uh, because that's what it is, especially early on in the symptoms, right? Because as humans, we're so used to being able to be in control of ourselves. The first time that something happens and you're like, I can't fix it. Like I can't, it's a helplessness that I think that most able-bodied people are not able to comprehend, because they are the masters of themselves. And we have had that power taken from us by our neurology, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think that really the community at large doesn't have a way of comprehending how it affects us.
Mm-hmm.
And then beyond that, like, they don't have to really think about it, so why would they, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that explains a lot of humanity about a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of it is that most of my able-bodied friends or family have absolutely no way of comprehending what it is to be completely without control of yourself.
How have your friends and family responded, and how are they around your dystonia?
So with my family especially, it's a normal part of our lives, right? As a child, it was very difficult for my parents especially. And I think that if you're a parent of a dystonic kid, like, you know how absolutely terrifying it is to go to doctors after doctors after doctors, and like they just don't have what you need. You see your child suffering in this particular way, and you feel helpless too, because all you're trying to do is make your child have a life that is a little less terrible with each of those steps. And for them, it was very difficult for both of my parents. And for my sister, because like I said, she's 10 months younger than me. But for her, I mean, so much of her childhood was lived in the shadow of a wheelchair. She never said anything negative about it, but most of her childhood was spent in hospitals next to me. Having a medically different sibling is very difficult. There was no time for her problems to be noticed. And so for particularly my parents and my sisters, it was a difficult thing, but they never made me feel that way. I was raised in a very religious way, American Christian evangelicalism. I was a part of a very loving church community that did not know how to handle disability in children. I would argue probably disability in anyone. From a place of love, they did a lot of things that were particularly traumatic to me. We were a part of a church family that had been in this particular church for 50 years by the time I was born. I mean, they were all family, and like I said, none of these people ever had any sort of malicious intent, but out of a place of love and out of a place of them wanting healing for me, I spent almost every Sunday of my childhood being carted down to the altar and anointed with oil and, God, will you heal her? Once it did happen that the medication worked, the word that was attached to the experience was miracle. And then I was sort of paraded as somebody who God touched. And holy hell, is that a lot of pressure for a little girl? And like I said, none of these people had any sort of malicious intent. But for them, it was very much a God-ordained thing that happened. And I felt that way for a long time. I'm not particularly religious anymore. And a lot of that has to do with the anger that I feel about how the situation was handled. I'm not mad at anybody about it. They handled the situation through the lens that they had, through believing that God did this for me. through their desire to glory God, they did a lot of long-term damage to me. I became, it became kind of a model minority situation. You have been given the greatest of gifts. You must prove that you have earned them, kind of a thing. So I always felt a lot of pressure to be perfect, to be academically perfect, to overachieve, to prove to people that no matter what cards you've been dealt, you can accomplish your dreams. I felt a lot of pressure to be special. And also, people always treated me as an inspirational character, which happens a lot to disabled folks, especially disabled children. Oh, you've been through so much, like, what an inspiration, when nobody ever asked to be an inspiration. They just asked to be able to live their damn life, you know? So the religious trauma part of it is something that I work through a lot with my therapist, and learning that I don't have to be perfect to be worthy. That part of it is still not 100% internalized. As far as my friends that I've made in adulthood, they kind of just are always in awe, right? Like, especially my dancing friends, because they'll see me out there cutting a rug and I look just like the person next to me. It's not a problem. And then I'll make some sort of offhanded comment about, yeah, I mean, like, I didn't walk till I was 7, like something like that. And they're like, wait, what? And then they kind of tend to do the, oh, wow, what an inspiration thing. And again, I know that it's coming from a good place, but I don't want to be somebody's inspiration. I just want to be able to be happy and live my life. I've never felt any particular kind of prejudice later in life about it. And my family especially, they never had lowered expectations of me because I wasn't able to walk. They were always just like, well, this is who you are. And it doesn't mean that you are less than in any way. And you are a strong and capable woman, and you will always be that. And that's not because you're in a wheelchair, it's because it's who you are. And I've never, I mean, like, as an adult, like, we're here this weekend, and I'm helping fix up this house and run this farm and all this kind of stuff, and they don't ever, nobody asks, like, oh, like, are your feet okay today? Like, they mind their business, so that's good.
Yeah. What's I mean, we're kind of going a little bit off the dystonia topic on this one, but I mean, so what is the overall plan with the future? What is it that you're setting up in your new home, and what?
Yeah, so my husband and I recently purchased a piece of property from our family in West Virginia that has been in the family since before 1900. And my great grandparents lived here, and had my great grandmother. She was born here at this farm, and it needed a new caretaker. It's been well taken care of and well loved and kept as a place to have family get together for our entire lives. But nobody has lived in this house since 1977, when my great grandfather passed away. And my cousins who were taking care of the property are in their 70s, and they were driving a couple hours each way to come and mow lots and lots of acres. And I don't know if you're familiar, but in West Virginia, things aren't flat. Like, nothing is flat. It's you can stand in one spot and you'll think that it's flat, but then you'll realize, like, one leg is doing a lot more work than the other. Like, there is no part of this land that is flat. So it was just way too much for them. And my husband, I when I met him, we met just before COVID, like the day that the state of Indiana shut down for COVID was our first date. So we had decided that we were going to go get dinner, and the governor in Indiana shut the whole state down at 1 p.m. Like, they're like, nope, can't do it. So I made probably the best and like the not the brightest decision in the middle of a pandemic, and I walked around the block with a stranger for a few hours. And I'm really glad that I did, because I met my husband, Jesse. And when I was meeting him, I was on a 6-month plan to sell my car and move to the heart of Philadelphia and be a city girl. And then I met Jesse, who loathes cities so much that he calls city parks tree prisons. He is I must be within spitting distance of nature or I cannot deal with my existence kind of person.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah. So it worked out that like this place is his dream place. It's 40 acres, mostly wooded and mountainous. We are planning on bringing some farm life back to it. After our baby is born in September, we're starting with ducks, and then we're going to go to goats and bees probably, and just kind of live our little homesteading life dreams, bring some life back to the farm. We've fenced in quite a big patch for our 2 dogs, Duke and Ella. They're named after Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald, because I am a lover of jazz music. And we're just gonna live in the middle of nowhere. I do mean in the middle of nowhere. There are 9,000 people in the entire county that we live in.
Amazing.
Yeah. There are 8 other houses in the holler that we live in. Holler, yes, the hollow between the hills. That is where we live, in the holler. And I'm excited to just work from home and go out and sit on the porch and listen to the birds chirp. And it's a nature paradise out here.
It sounds like absolute bliss. Absolute bliss.
It is. It is. If anybody ever needs to come commiserate about dystonia and hang out in the mountains for a few days, just give me a call.
Shelby, before we finish up then, is there any messages or anything you'd like to say to friends, family in the dystonia community that are listening to the podcast?
Yeah. So I think that this is the one that I gave the most thought. And it's the hardest question to answer, I think. Because first of all, we're not often given the opportunities to speak to people who have dystonia, right? Like, I have never in my life in person met another dystonia patient. So thinking about what in the hell do I say was a difficult question to answer, but it came to me earlier this morning. 2 folks struggling with dystonia. The first thing that I would tell you is you don't have to be an inspiration. Like you don't. So much of this sucks so hard. And you're allowed to feel that. And allow yourself to feel that. I didn't for a long time allow myself to mourn the parts of my life that I lost to this. You're allowed to take the time you need to be sad about it, be mad about it. Yeah, that was not easy. Especially when you feel like you have to spend every moment fighting to even be heard. Don't be apologetic about being pissed off about it. Like, just don't. You don't owe anybody positivity about it. You don't owe anybody silence about it either. And you are allowed to be surrounded and supported by people who can handle your hurt about it. And you deserve the space to grieve and to rage against all of it, and you deserve the space to fight in whatever way works for you. And that's not going to look the same for everybody. For so long I felt the need to be the poster child for it all, right? To be the proof that it could go away, and that's not the reality of it all. Like, that's not the reality, right? And I didn't really have much of a perspective of that coming into it. I mean, for me, it was a thing that was treatable, and that is a reality for so little of us. And I am often reminded how lucky I am to find a treatment that works. And I was worried about talking in this format about it because I listen to the stories of other people, especially the stories of people on your podcast, and I hear myself when I was 7, and I hear the desperation of this isn't changing. And I don't ever want people to think that I take that for granted. But I also wanted to do this because I know that not every neurologist is going to know what to try. And so if this means that you hearing this and your daughter or son is 8 years old and I can't figure out what it is, and at worst, this drug is going to make them sick to their stomach, but at best, they have the opportunity at a life less sucky, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted people to hear, I mean, there's nothing gonna hurt you from trying, you know? Especially because there's not really much of a way to get all these doctors to comprehend or to talk to them like, hey, there is something that you could try. I think for parents, specifically of children or family members, taking care of folks that are struggling with dystonia, is allow them that space, right? Allow them to be people, and know that whatever this is causing in your life, whatever strife this is causing in your life, whether it's having to provide extra care, or, you know, I especially for us Americans, medical debt, right? Like things like that, whatever additional strife this is causing in your life, it will always pale in comparison to the absolute horror of the reality that they live every day. And that doesn't mean that your struggles are not real too, but it's not their fault. And they need to know, and they need to hear that it's not their fault. That was another thing that I didn't comprehend as a child. Like, my parents never made me feel that way, but when you are the center of so much pain in a family, like, it's hard not to feel guilty. And so telling your loved ones with dystonia, you are loved for so many reasons. And I'm glad that you're here for so many reasons. And I know that I can never comprehend what you're going through, but I want you to know that none of this makes me not love you, and none of this makes me wish that you weren't here. And I will be your advocate when you can't do it for yourself anymore. And I will hold you when you cry, and I will take you to your doctor's appointments and help you get your medication and do all of these things, because you are worth it for who you are, not for any intended outcome, or you're not worth it if you're fixed. It's not that. You are worth the effort because you are precious as a person. And I think, especially when you're trapped in the mundane and the everyday of, I mean, like, is it going to be worse today? Is it going to be better? Because those days happen. Like, there are days when you're like, wow, like, I feel great. And there are days when there's just nothing that could get you out of bed. If your loved one is struggling with that, just be there, often in silence sometimes, is what I've found. I support you. And if you just need to be mad at the world today, cool, I'll listen. Yeah, I think that those are my two things. Like, just don't force yourself to be an inspiration, and like allow yourself to grieve and allow yourself to feel all of the things, because holy hell is it heavy. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Shelby. Really appreciate you coming on to the podcast today.
Thank you so
It was
much.
great to be able to share your story. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you for what you're doing, getting these stories out there and connecting us all in a little bit more meaningful way. And I really appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you so much for listening to the Warriors of Dystonia podcast. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can reach me via the Warriors of Dystonia website, which is warriorsofdystonia.wordpress.com, or you can search for Warriors of Dystonia on Google, and that will also bring you to my website. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook, and just do a search for Warriors of Dystonia and you'll be able to find me there. I'm Carl, and I wish you all the best. Thank you so much again for listening. Take care.